April 12, 1945. Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had led America through Depression and World War for 12 years, sat for a portrait in his modest cottage. At 1:15 p.m., he raised his hand to his temple and whispered, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Then he slumped forward. Within 2 hours, the President of the United States was dead. For 1,000 miles away in London, Winston Churchill was preparing for dinner when the call came through. The Prime Minister who had forged an unbreakable alliance with Roosevelt, who had written him over 1,700 letters during the war, was about to receive news that would shake him to his core. What Churchill said in the hours that followed would reveal the depth of friendship that had quite literally saved Western civilization. But more than that, it would expose his darkest fears about the future. Because Roosevelt's death didn't just remove a political ally. It removed the one man standing between Churchill and a post-war world he believed would fall into chaos. The message Churchill sent to Eleanor Roosevelt that night has been quoted countless times. But what he wrote in his private notes, words that remain classified for decades, told a very different story. A story of panic, grief, and a geopolitical nightmare he saw rushing toward him. This is what really happened in the 48 hours after Franklin Roosevelt died. And this is what Churchill truly said when the cameras weren't watching. To understand Churchill's reaction, we must go back to August 1941. That's when these two men, a British aristocrat and an American patrician, met for the first time aboard the HMS Prince of Wales off the coast of Newfoundland. Roosevelt wasn't even at war yet. America remained stubbornly neutral, while Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. But Churchill needed American support desperately. His cities were being bombed nightly. His troops were stretched across 3 continents. And Soviet Russia, now Hitler's target, was bleeding divisions at a rate that couldn't be sustained. What emerged from that meeting was more than military cooperation. It was a genuine friendship built on shared jokes, late-night conversations, and mutual respect. Churchill would later write, "I felt I was in contact with a very great man who was also a warm-hearted friend." Over the next 4 years, they would meet 9 times. They exchanged nearly 2,000 messages. They planned D-Day together. They negotiated with Stalin together. And gradually, Churchill came to depend on Roosevelt not just strategically, but emotionally. But by early 1945, cracks were showing. At Yalta in February, just 2 months before his death, Roosevelt looked terrible. His hands trembled. His face had turned gray. Churchill's personal physician, Lord Moran, noted in his diary, "The president appears a very sick man. He has lost perhaps 30 pounds. He is listless and absent." More troubling for Churchill was Roosevelt's shifting stance on post-war Europe. The American president was increasingly willing to accommodate Stalin's demands for Eastern European territory. He spoke openly about withdrawing U.S. troops from Europe within 2 years of victory. And he seemed irritated by Churchill's warnings about Soviet expansionism, warnings Roosevelt dismissed as outdated imperial thinking. Churchill saw the world dividing into 2 hostile camps. He believed only American power could prevent Soviet domination of Europe, and he believed only Roosevelt understood this truth. But what Churchill had planned, a final, desperate attempt to convince Roosevelt of the Soviet threat, would never happen. Because on April 12th, while Churchill was reviewing intelligence reports about Soviet troop movements in Poland, his private secretary entered the room with a telegram. It contained just 7 words from the British Embassy in Washington. "President Roosevelt died this afternoon suddenly." Churchill froze. According to witnesses, his face went completely white. And what he did next would shock everyone in 10 Downing Street. 4:45 p.m. London time, less than 4 hours after Roosevelt's death, Churchill immediately canceled all appointments. He ordered his staff to locate every cabinet member. And he did something he rarely did. He asked to be left completely alone for 30 minutes. What happened during that half hour remains partially mysterious. But we know from declassified documents that Churchill drafted 3 separate messages. The first was a public telegram to Eleanor Roosevelt, eloquent, heartfelt, appropriate for a grieving widow. The second went to Harry Truman, the new president, a man Churchill had met exactly once. The third message was marked most secret and addressed to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. That document wasn't declassified until 1972, and its contents revealed Churchill's immediate, visceral fear about what Roosevelt's death meant. The president's passing, Churchill wrote, removes the only barrier between our post-war vision and complete Soviet domination of the continent. I fear we are now alone in ways we were not even in 1940. Alone. That word is crucial, because in 1940, Britain stood militarily alone against Hitler, but Churchill had believed America would eventually join. Now, in 1945, with victory over Germany weeks away, Churchill felt politically alone in recognizing what he saw as the next great threat. While Churchill was writing these messages, across London, Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky was meeting with his NKVD handlers. Soviet intelligence had intercepted British diplomatic traffic and knew about Churchill's anxiety. In a report sent to Moscow that night, discovered in Soviet archives after the Cold War, Maisky wrote, "Churchill is in a state of extreme agitation. Roosevelt's death has isolated him. He will now attempt desperate measures to convince the Americans of our hostile intentions. We must move quickly to consolidate our position in Poland and the Balkans before the new president establishes his bearings." Stalin was already moving. Even as Roosevelt lay dying in Georgia, Soviet troops were arresting non-communist Polish resistance leaders in violation of the Yalta Agreements. Stalin knew Roosevelt had been the primary advocate for giving the Soviets benefit of the doubt. Now that restraint was gone. But what about Harry Truman? The new president had been vice president for only 82 days. Roosevelt had barely spoken to him. Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb project. He had attended none of the big three conferences, and his foreign policy experience was virtually non-existent. At 7:09 p.m. that evening, Truman was sworn in as president in the cabinet room of the White House. At 7:45 p.m., Churchill's first telegram arrived. It was perfectly crafted, warm but not presumptuous, expressing condolences while subtly emphasizing continuation of our close collaboration. What Churchill didn't say in that telegram was more revealing. He made no mention of Stalin, no mention of Poland, no mention of Soviet treaty violations that were occurring at that very moment, because Churchill understood something critical. Truman was an unknown quantity. One wrong move could push him toward isolationism, or worse, toward Stalin's camp. Meanwhile, in Warm Springs, Georgia, Eleanor Roosevelt was beginning the awful task of notifying her children. The cottage where Franklin had died was being sealed. His body was being prepared for the journey back to Washington. And on the president's desk, staff found an unfinished speech he'd been writing, a speech scheduled for delivery on April 13th, Jefferson Day. The final line Roosevelt had written before his stroke read, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." Churchill would later say that line haunted him, because his doubts about tomorrow, about a world without Roosevelt, were overwhelming. By 11 p.m. London time, Churchill had made a decision. He would fly to Washington for the funeral. His staff advised against it. The war with Germany was still raging, and the Prime Minister's presence was needed in London. But Churchill was insistent. "I must pay my respects," he told his private secretary, John Colville. Then he added something Colville recorded in his diary, but which wasn't made public for decades. "And I must take the measure of this man Truman before Stalin does." What happened at that funeral, and in Churchill's private meeting with Truman, would set the course for the next 50 years of history. But first, Churchill had to survive the worst night of his political life. Because on April 13th, as the news of Roosevelt's death spread across the world, Churchill broke down completely. April 13th, 1945, 2:30 a.m. Churchill's private study at 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister sat alone with a bottle of whiskey and his personal diary, a leather-bound journal he kept locked in his desk. What he wrote during those early morning hours remained private until his death in 1965, when his family authorized selective publication of his wartime diaries. The entry for April 13th, 1945, is devastating. "I am greatly distressed," Churchill wrote. "Franklin's death is a loss almost too great to bear. But it is not grief for a friend that torments me now. It is dread for the world we are about to inherit. He continued, "Who is to understand the danger we face? Who will stand with us as the red tide sweeps across Europe? I fear we have won the war, but lost the peace." Then came the passage that revealed Churchill's true assessment of Roosevelt's death. The president's great strength was that he alone could master Stalin, not through force of arms, which we possess, but through force of personality, which Truman does not yet command. Franklin could negotiate from power because he embodied power. Stalin respected him, perhaps even feared him. Now, Stalin will see only opportunity. Churchill paused in his writing. According to his bodyguard, Walter Thompson, who checked on him at 3 a.m., the prime minister was weeping, something Thompson had witnessed only once before, during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain. But Churchill wasn't finished. He wrote one more paragraph that historians consider the most prophetic analysis of the post-war world by any contemporary leader. An iron curtain is descending across Europe. I can see it now. Berlin divided, Poland enslaved, the Balkans consumed. And we, who fought so desperately to prevent one form of tyranny, will be powerless to prevent another. Franklin understood this, I believe, in his final weeks, but he did not live to act upon it. Whether Truman can learn quickly enough remains to be seen. I fear he cannot. An iron curtain. Churchill wouldn't use that phrase publicly for another 11 months, in his famous speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. But he had conceived it, crystallized it, and feared it within hours of Roosevelt's death. At dawn on April 13th, Churchill emerged from his study. He had composed himself. His public telegram to Eleanor Roosevelt, released to the press that morning, was eloquent and moving. "I have lost a dear and cherished friendship which was forged in the fire of war. I trust you may find consolation in the glory of his name and the magnitude of his work." Beautiful words, true words, but not the complete truth. The complete truth was in that diary entry. The complete truth was that Churchill saw Roosevelt's death not primarily as a personal loss, though it was that, but as a geopolitical catastrophe that would reshape the world order in ways that terrified him. 3 days later, Churchill flew to Washington for Roosevelt's funeral. He stood in the East Room of the White House and watched as the casket was carried out. According to witnesses, tears streamed down his face. But Averell Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who stood nearby, later recalled, "Winston wasn't just crying for Franklin. He was crying for all of us, for what he knew was coming." After the funeral, Churchill met privately with President Truman for 45 minutes. No official record of that conversation exists. Both men agreed to keep it off the books. But Truman's handwritten notes, discovered in his presidential library in 1983, contain one revealing line. Churchill believes Stalin is our enemy now. He wants us to take a hard line immediately. I told him I need time to learn the job. Time, the one commodity Churchill knew they didn't have. Within weeks, Churchill's nightmare began to materialize. On April 23 RD, 11 days after Roosevelt's death, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but Stalin's armies didn't go home. They occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany. Every government that emerged in those territories was communist, controlled directly from Moscow. Non-communist politicians were arrested, exiled, or executed. Churchill watched it happen with a sense of terrible vindication. He had been right, but being right brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge that he'd been unable to prevent it. President Truman, to his credit, learned quickly. By July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the final Big Three meeting of the war, Truman had adopted a much harder line towards Soviet expansion. Churchill noticed the change immediately and later wrote to him, "You have grasped in 3 months what took me 3 years to understand about our Russian allies." But by then, the map of Europe was essentially fixed. The division Churchill had foreseen was complete. The Cold War, though not yet named, had begun. On March 5, 1946, Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman sitting on the stage beside him. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Churchill declared, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase electrified the world. Many Americans thought Churchill was being too aggressive, too confrontational. But Truman understood. In private, he told Churchill, "You were right all along. I only wish Franklin had lived to see it. Would Roosevelt have seen it? That's the great counterfactual of the 20th century." Some historians argue that Roosevelt, had he lived, would have recognized Soviet aggression and responded forcefully, that his illness at Yalta, not his judgment, had led to concessions. Others believe Roosevelt's fundamental optimism about Stalin was genuine and unchangeable, that only his death allowed Truman to adopt a containment strategy that defined the Cold War. Churchill himself wrestled with this question for the rest of his life. In his 6-volume history of World War II, published between 1948 and 1953, he wrote tenderly of Roosevelt, praising his leadership, celebrating their friendship, honoring his memory. But in private correspondence, Churchill remained conflicted. In a 1950 letter to his wife, Clementine, Churchill wrote, "I still wonder what Franklin would have done. Would he have seen the danger, as Harry did? Or would he have tried to befriend Stalin to the very end? I love Franklin dearly, but I cannot say with certainty which path he would have chosen. What we can say with certainty is this. Roosevelt's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Anglo-American alliance he and Churchill forged won the Second World War, but the post-war world they envisioned together never came to pass. Churchill's reaction to Roosevelt's death, his private anguish, his prophetic fears, his desperate attempt to make Truman understand, reveals a man who saw the future with remarkable clarity. He understood that personalities matter in history, that leadership is not easily replaced, and that the absence of one great man can alter the course of nations. On January 24th, 1965, Winston Churchill died in London at the age of 90. Among his personal effects was a photograph of Franklin Roosevelt, inscribed, "For Winston with affection and respect." Churchill had kept it on his desk for 20 years. The story of how these two men, so different in background, yet so aligned in purpose, transformed the 20th century is one of history's great partnerships. And the story of how Churchill confronted Roosevelt's death reveals something even more profound, that in the loneliest moments, leaders must see beyond grief to the hard truths that shape the world. If you want to discover more untold stories from World War II, stories of leadership, sacrifice, and the decisions that change history, make sure you're subscribed. Because the real lessons of the past are found not in textbooks, but in the private moments when great men face impossible choices.